Hello and welcome to the Esri GeoDev webinar series. This webinar is a continuation of the series we created in the hopes of engaging in developer-related topics and discussions in between Dev Summits. We have our Developer Summit Europe coming up October 23rd through 25th, and we would love to have conversations like these taking place throughout the year so that when we do meet in October, it will be as though we never stopped. We hope you get as much or more out of this webinar than you anticipated. Now, we would like to introduce you to today's webinar, Styling Vector Basemaps. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select Use Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Sean McGee, Developer Evangelist at Esri UK, and Richard Mumford, Technical Research Consultant with Esri UK. Richard, let's get started, shall we?
Sure, thank you very much. So welcome everybody to the webinar on styling vector basemaps. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to take you through a quick session overview so you know what to expect. And because we have a mixed audience today, we're going to start with the basics and make sure everyone's on the same page. So we're going to quickly start by talking about why we use basemaps in the first place. And then we'll move on to talk about the two main types of basemaps, being raster and vector. After that, we'll tell you how to make your own basemaps. We'll show you some cool samples to hopefully inspire you, and then talk about how to customize vector basemaps to your needs. And finally, we'll give you some tips and tricks on how to use vector basemaps in your own development projects. So without further ado, let's get started. So why do we use basemaps? We certainly don't have to use basemaps. Here's what a GIS could look like without one. We have 2 points here. They're perfectly geographically correct. We can perform analysis on them, we can symbolize them, we can do anything that we want to them. But crucially, as an onlooker, they don't really mean much to us. It's really hard to understand what they could be. Are they 2 houses across the street from each other? Maybe. Are they 2 different branches of a store in different counties? Or maybe they're 2 features in the very same room. We just don't know. And that's where basemaps come in. Let's put a basemap underneath this data, and suddenly we can understand it more. They're 2 different points in 2 different countries. So in a nutshell, basemaps are all about giving a contextual backdrop to our data. So if that's why we use them, what are they actually made of? It looks on the screen like it's just a continuous image underneath our data, but that's not quite true. If we strip this away, we'll see something quite different. So this is a tiling scheme for a basemap, and it reveals the secret that basemaps are actually made of lots of small individual tiles. You'll notice a couple of things about these tiles. So this particular example is a map of Great Britain, and you'll see that as we move away from the land, the tiles get bigger. Because this basemap isn't interested in bathymetry, we don't need much detail in the ocean, so the tiles are bigger and offer less detail. But as we move towards the land, the tiles get smaller and more detailed. And then finally, when we get into the major cities, the tiles are the smallest and the most densely compact to give us the most detail. So this tile-based architecture gives us a few advantages. And all of them are based around efficiency. If you imagine we had to have a single image that would take us from a national level all the way down to centimeter accuracy, that image would be enormous. And every time somebody wanted to view the map, they'd have to download it, and it would take forever. But with tiles, we can get around this. We can choose just the tiles that we want to give us the level of detail in the area that we're looking at. And all of this means that we get much better performance and optimum level of detail. So if all base maps are made of tiles, why do we talk about two different types of base maps? It turns out these individual tiles can be made of two different things. They can either be raster based, which is a more traditional way of doing things, and when we're doing this, each tile is pixel based. It's essentially a PNG image. And this is perfectly valid. Even though we say it's a traditional approach, it's great for things like satellite imagery, where we need photorealism in our base maps. But the other way we can do it, and the more modern way, is with vectors. So this isn't pixel-based, it's geometry-based. Essentially, we have points, lines, and polygons representing the same data as before. So there are advantages to both of these. And just before we jump into those, I wanted to show you a quick demonstration of what both of these base maps look like. So jumping over here, we have a base map, just a simple base map, no data or anything, and we're looking at Edinburgh. This particular one is a raster base map. So let's start to explore it and notice a couple of things. Firstly, as we zoom in, all of the labels refresh with each zoom level. This is because they're actually baked into the images, the tile images. You might also notice that the resolution of the tiles isn't quite as high as it should be on this high resolution display. And this is particularly the case if we zoom in further, and we can actually reach the limit to which these tiles have been cached, at which point they start to pixelate. So this is a limitation of raster tiles. And if we switch over to the vector version in exactly the same place, you'll notice that it's very sharp straight away. And we can zoom in as far as we want and it remains sharp because vectors can scale indefinitely. You'll also notice that the labels behave slightly differently as we zoom. And that's because they're not baked into the tiles. Another advantage of this is that if we grab the map and rotate it, the labels stay the correct way up. This is particularly useful for things like satellite navigation apps where the map is going to be constantly turning to face your direction. So for this reason and a couple of others, vectors offer us an increased user experience. They're just a bit nicer to use. But that's not the only reason we use them. There's another really key factor in this, and that's file size. So this is an example of the Ordnance Survey Open Carto base map. And if we wanted the whole of the UK in a British National Grid projection, with a raster base map, we're looking at around 24, 25 gigabytes. So that's a sizable amount of data. But if we change that for a vector base map, which to all intent and purposes will look the same, if not a little bit better, we can fit that in under 1 gigabyte. And this is crucial because if we want to take this out into the field, disconnected on a mobile device, we can. Not only that, but if we wanted to take a base map for the entire world onto a mobile device, in vector format, again, we could just about do that. Whereas in a raster format, we wouldn't stand a chance. Under the hood, we use an open specification for our base maps. If you want to know a bit more about the nuts and bolts of this, you can head over to GitHub and find the specification here. We love to use and contribute to open specifications here at Esri because we believe it offers many great benefits such as interoperability between systems and many other things. So we offer many curated base maps with ArcGIS, and you're quite likely to find one that fits your needs. But if you don't, you might want to make your own base map, and vectors make that much easier. And so I'm going to hand over to Sean, and he's going to explain that to you.
Great, thank you, Richard. So how are vector base maps created? So vector base maps are initially created in one of Esri's desktop products, and that is ArcGIS Pro. So I've actually got that same scene or same image we see a little bit earlier from Richard, so the index grid. And if I hide this and actually look at the data, we can think about a basemap as simply just being points, lines, and polygons. So this is an unstyled basemap, and the points are frequently symbolized as text symbols. So we can actually use ArcGIS Pro to author the basemaps, and there's two ways we could do that. The first is to go to Analysis, Tools, and then just search for Vector. We have the option to create a vector tile package, which is then can then be uploaded into ArcGIS Online. The second way is to go to Share, Web Layer, Publish Web Layer, and select Vector Tile. So we can actually symbolize the layers. So if I just drop down this here and select a point, we have the ability to symbolize the layers on the right-hand side here. So that's how a vector basemap can be published, and it's worth noting that local projections are supported for this. It's now worth going and showing you some cool samples of styled vector basemaps. This is an ArcGIS Online groups page for vector basemaps. There's actually 60 in this group. They're all authored and available in the Living Atlas. I'm not going to go through every one, but I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite. And one of the good things about having text symbols is that you can change the language if needed. So if it was baked into the raster basemap, as Richard mentioned before, with vector, it can just be a slight change. So this is charted territory. This style is meant to replicate a school classroom type map. It was actually only released, I think it was last month at UC. And there's quite a unique styling where each country is styled a little bit differently. And one of the things that's worth noting is you'll see the font type changing as I toggle through some of these basemaps. This is the colored pencil basemap. You see there's quite a drastic change in the cartography and style. It's got this quite unique hand-drawn looking style applied to the background and the land. The icons have also changed. You can see this hand-drawn style pin, and not only with font, but there's actually multiple fonts now in this basemap. So if we look where it says English Channel compared to Margate, it's different. The third one is the Nova basemap. This is a sci-fi inspired basemap with some really cool looking glowing blue symbology. And you'll see the use of patterns quite highly in this. So in the background, I don't know, you can faintly see is a square with a cross in between. And some of the areas of landmass like fields have got these lines going through it. This last one, again, has this quite overly stylized map. It has the wave type pattern in the background. But what makes this quite unique is there's individual symbologies for certain areas. So they've not just applied the symbology worldwide, there's like unique symbols, such as in France having the Eiffel Tower. Cool. So that's a couple of cool samples of vector basemaps and different styles. So how do we actually customize vector basemaps? So I'm going to be talking about 3 applications. On the very right, I've only briefly gone over it, but ArcGIS Pro is probably the most complex, but will give you the most customization options for styling. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got MapStyler, which is built for very quick, easy wins for styling, and it's very, very simple to use. But in the middle, and probably the Goldilocks zone, is the ArcGIS Vector Tile style editor, and it's probably what I'm mainly speaking about in this webinar. So I'm going to show you MapStyler first. This is MapStyler. And also it's worth noting all of the pages and tabs and applications I do have open will be linked out afterwards, as well as the slides. So yeah, this is MapStyler. The idea of MapStyler is it will automatically style a base map based on a picture that's added to the scene. So we're using the Unsplash API just to get a random picture. And you can see how the whole base map is styled based on the pixels. So what this does is it gets dominant colors inside the picture and tries to find the best solution to style the base map. One of the unique features about this is it does give you a color palette at the bottom, but it creates automatically in the background a gradient of colors. So you can see it differentiates this base background, buildings, and the building shadow automatically. If you're not completely happy with the color, you can go in and change it. So selecting it and either typing in a hex code or just using the color palette. You also have the ability to shuffle the colors around on an individual image. But where we see this being used the most is with custom images. One of the ones I found recently is someone using MapStyler to author a football style base map. So they used a logo for a football team. I'm just going to drag this last one in just to show that it does also support normal images as well. And it'll try and pick out the dominant colors inside that. The next application is the Vector Tile Style Editor. Now, this is in beta. It was only released, or it released to beta about 2 months ago. So I just thought I would note that. So when you first open the editor, you're given a huge or an array of tabs at the very top. So with these tabs, there are almost starting points for different base maps. Now, some of these base maps are purely just different styles. So I'm just going to zoom in here. So the difference between dark gray canvas and light gray canvas is purely there's a slight style change on that. But some of these base maps have completely different geometry as the base. Also, they choose to show certain roads or certain features based on the extent / where the user is zoomed. Now, the next tab is creative. So we actually see a couple of these earlier. We see the colored pencil and Nova. So if you just wanted to do a couple tweaks to this, then you can just use this and then select style to get started. And there's one I'm going to be going back to a little bit later called newspaper. This newspaper style has this really cool square pattern in the background, as well as on the landmass. But we'll get back to this one. The next tab is base. So base is basically a vector base map, but without labels. So this is really, really good if you wanted like a muted style cartography without labels. And we've got a few different options to get started with that. And conversely, label and reference is just the labels without any of the base map. The last two tabs are quite self-explanatory. So that's all of these combined with all Esri base maps. And then the last one being My Styles. So if you're signed in to ArcGIS Online, you get the option to actually look and edit your own previous styles that you've added before. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just run through the editor by selecting the light gray canvas. You may notice at the very left-hand side, we have the tab or the icon Quick Edit selected. So Quick Edit is very, very similar to MapStyler at the top. So with MapStyler, what we did is, if I go back over to that, is each of these colors are associated to different parts of the vector style. So for example, the line color, so that's for the text, you can actually change the color purely just by changing this one value here, as well as the landmass. We can do that in the quick edit inside the vector tile style editor. So I'm actually just going to quickly do that here and just make it a little bit darker. And apply that at the bottom left. Okay. We also have the ability, and something we can't do in MapStyler already, is to change the font worldwide straight on this quick edit panel. And for those that are really interested to get into the nitty-gritty and the details of what is possible with a vector basemap and the styling options, there is a document available, so the Esri Vector Basemaps reference. So I'll be linking this afterwards as well. And this dictates that currently there's only support for 128 different fonts, but they'll be available in this editor here. Now, at the very bottom, there's label contrast. This is basically just to make the label and the text pop if you need to. And it's only really useful when you're using quite muted colors. And the random generate button is similar, and we'll just shuffle all of the colors at the top. Okay. Now the next tab is the Edit Layer Styles. This will group all of the styles possible and trying to make it easy. So if you wanted to style, let's say, all of the water, all of the buildings at once, you can do that just by selecting on a group, and you have the ability to do a quick edit on that. But first, I've selected the background layer. I'm actually just going to change the pattern type. So I know we see a couple of patterns earlier applied. So I'm just going to add a diagonal line. I know this is not the best looking base map at the moment, but this is just the technicalities of the base map first and the editor. But one thing we may have noticed is on the right hand side, there's actually 4 different views. There's a main view, and there is a slight little widget at the top which shows the zoom level. But at the very bottom left, where the ocean is, so the English Channel, we're actually not seeing the same line. Now this is because if we zoom in, we're actually changing, and the base map is looking at a different layer in this area. So actually what it's doing is it's using a water level all of a sudden, as soon as we get to that extent, because it's the same color. So what we can do is just completely enable and or disable layers. So if I toggle that off here, now at the very bottom, so when we're in view zoom level 5, we can see through that. So if I zoom in, it should look fine now. Now, when we select polygons, we have the ability to style the outline. So when we select an area that has a polygon, we can choose and affect the outline color. The last tab that I'm going to talk about in regards to styling is the select color to replace. Now this is very useful if you start to have a collection of style base maps and you just want to do a slight color tweak. So for example, if I want to make this pink color to a red and apply that, it should automatically apply on the map. Now, actually my favorite feature about the editor, and I first thought it was worth showing you the manual way and the layers first, but what you can do is just select layers just by clicking on it. So I've just selected the land, and I can easily just change the look of, and color and pattern just by selecting features. This makes this editor really, really powerful and quick and easy to use. So what I'm going to do now is set myself a little bit of a challenge. We'll see how it goes. But what I'm going to try to do is replicate the newspaper style base map. So the style on this, again, just to reiterate, is there's a pattern in the background, which is then visible through the landmass. And also there is 2 font changes that I can see. So the ocean has a different font compared to every other label. So I'm going to try and do this based on a light gray canvas. And let's see how this goes. So we're going to start again, do a refresh, and start from a light gray canvas. So first things first, I'm going to change the fonts for the world. So luckily I noted this down earlier, so it's using an Oswald font type. And just apply that. So again, with Quick Edit, I can change all of the fonts for the whole world instantly. But the oceans had a different label. So I could go into that Layers tab on the left-hand side, but I'd rather just select it and then change the font type just by selecting on the icon itself and the point itself. Cool. Now, I'm going to add in the pattern style that we see before. So I'm going to zoom out, select the background, and add in this nice dotted pattern effect. Now we're going to have the same problem I mentioned before with the ocean basically coming through rather than the background. So to do it, I'm going to go to water, select the water tab, and then disable all water, just so we can see through for this style. Now lastly, I'm going to select the landmass and just add a little bit of opacity on that, just so we can see through the land. And then change the color just slightly, just so it pops and differentiates from the sea itself. So this actually was very, very quick to do. It probably only took me like 2 minutes to do while doing the webinar. And this hopefully can show you how powerful this vector tile style editor is. But there's something I actually haven't mentioned yet, as it's quite critical. It's actually how do you save and use these styles once you've created them? So with both MapStyler as well as the vector tile style editor, you can just select save. So I'm actually going to save this as newspaper 5. And when you save this, it will save into your ArcGIS Online account. So you noticed earlier that I signed in, so this is going to be automatically added into my content. This also works with MapStyler. There's just a save icon at the bottom left. So I've gone to my content in ArcGIS Online, and the newspaper 5, the layer I've just created, is now visible. So I'm just going to select into that layer type. And note that the layer is actually just a vector tile service. We'll go on to that in a little bit. We have the options on the right-hand side to open this in a map view. So I'm actually going to do that instantly. This will then open this style that we just created in ArcGIS Online. One thing you may notice is there is a clash of symbology as well as a clash of labels. And that's because we're actually just loading in a tile layer. So you have to do a little bit more to set this as the base map. If we select the 3 dots and then move to base map option, all we'd need to do then is remove the existing base map that was in the scene. And I'm just going to relabel the base map newspaper. So that's how we attach the vector base map to the background and the base map. Now, because this is a GeoDev webinar, we're going to talk a bit more about development as well. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about how the editor was created, but very high level. So we have the ability to view style just below scene. So scene is going to be the 3D viewer. It's going to do the same thing as the map viewer, but I'm going to select where it said view style. So this, if you can see at the URL at the top, it's probably a little bit small, but this style is actually just a JSON file. So it's a pretty big JSON file, but it is just a JSON file. And actually, if you look into it, and I should probably add a little caveat here, I have a JSON file handler, so a JSON file viewer Chrome extension installed. So that's why it kind of neatly is visible by me. But this is actually just readable via the human eye. So we can actually work out exactly what's happening here. So this is a water play area with a specific color set and some zoom levels attached. So if we really wanted to, we could go in, if I go back here, download the style and edit this with an editor. We have the ability to update the style. So if we decide to edit it, then we can update the style here. Now, both MapStyler as well as the tile editor just change the schema. That's all they really do. So it's a UI-based editor that changes the JSON file inside it. There's one thing that is worth noting. There are certain criteria and zoom extents for specific features. So things like buildings, you couldn't have visible when you're at such a large scale. So if I zoom out here, so even if you tried to go inside the JSON file and make the buildings technically visible in code, they won't be visible. And that's, again, based on the documentation I mentioned earlier. If you wanted to read about that more, it'd be available here. Okay. So now we've seen how we would open it and view it inside ArcGIS Online. What I'm going to do now is show you how to actually put this JSON file and style inside an application. So I'm actually going to choose JavaScript for this. So I'm going to head over to developers.arcgis.com, and I'm going to be using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. This can be applied across our APIs and SDKs, but I'm just choosing JavaScript just because it's an easy one to demo. So I've selected sample code and I'm searching for vector. There's a vector tile layer sample available here, so I'm just going to select into that. And if you remember earlier, when we author the style in ArcGIS Online, the layer is a vector tile layer. So I'm going to select edit in sandbox. And for those that haven't seen a sandbox editor before, basically all of the code on the left-hand side is used to generate what we see on the right-hand side. And we can refresh at the very top right where it says refresh to actually change and add the code. So this is almost like a live viewer to see code changes. Now this is a very, very simple sample. What we have is an empty map, so there's nothing inside this map. We have a view, and the default view is that thing is looking at America with a zoom extent. And we have a tile layer. Now, you may remember this layer from earlier on, it's the Nova base map. And to add it inside the scene, all that's added is the JSON. So what we can do is just paste in that JSON that we created for the newspaper, which will be this one here, and swap it. Now with my layer, I did make it private, so I'm going to need an ArcGIS on, or I'm going to need to log in to view it. But you can make that public, and it wouldn't be any problem. So that's how quick and easy it is to actually edit and put inside an application. Okay. So the next couple of slides and demos are going to be some development tips and tricks when using vector basemaps. So these are tips from myself and Richard when we create applications that we sometimes like to adhere to. The first one is background. So I've just loaded a simple base map. So this is pretty much the same sample as we see before, but we've got a dark gray vector base map on this. So just think of it as a normal base map, and this tip does work with raster as well as vector. But when you pan around a map, something you may notice is if a tile is loading, you can actually see through to the background. So apologies, I imagine this is a little bit laggy to see on the webinar, but hopefully you can see this white trail when I'm panning quite fast. So one of the tips, and the first tip, is what you can do is if you change the background of the div or the background of the element where your map is to the same color as the background of your style. So I've actually got that code uncommented. So now if you give this a refresh, if I do the same thing and move around, you'll notice that yes, it still is loading. It's not going to increase performance, but because the contrast is a lot less dramatic, it does look a lot better. That's tip number one. The second tip is you can change styles if need be in the same scene, quite simply. So Richard develops this application, and what it does is it looks at your time, so your system time, and works out if it's basically day or night. What it'll then do is choose the appropriate styling for if it's day and night and apply it to the scene. So I'm just going to move around here. We also added a toggle button at the very top right. But note when we swap styles that the transfer rate doesn't change. So if we go to a different area here, once it's loaded, if we toggle it, all we're doing is realistically applying a different style to the cache tiles that are already downloaded. So you can potentially have multiple styles in the same scene, and you can switch between it quite simply. There is another method of changing styles, and that is using opacity and potentially having two layers on top of each other and then have one as a set interval that swoops. Now, it's worth noting, when I do this toggle, you actually may notice the first tip that we gave, so changing the background color. So when I do the toggle, it actually changes to day and night or the background of the div. That's just a quick little tip there. The third tip is adding a feature layer under a base map. So this is possible, depending on which versions of the API you are using. But I will show you a quick sample of that in a little bit. The fourth one would be deleting your base map. Now, I decided to add this in after seeing quite a lot of open code on GitHub and different samples that it's quite a common mistake. So I'm just going to go over basically what that is and where you can try to avoid that. So if you have styled a vector base map, if you remember when you put it inside the sandbox, it's a vector layer and a vector tile layer. But my map is actually empty. So this sample, the map is actually empty. But some people I have seen in the past accidentally leaving the original base map still in and still intact. So if you do that, it's going to potentially affect the performance of the application, as well as the user will be downloading tiles unnecessarily. And I'm going to put a little bit more emphasis on that as well. So if you are using, so for this case, I use the light gray canvas vector. I don't need to have that in the scene. All I need to do is add the vector tile layer and it'll apply. And the fifth tip is labels above data. So I've created another sample. And what this does is it showcases that you can have potentially a feature layer under a vector tile layer. So what we've got, if you remember back when we first had opened the vector tile editor, we've got a base layer being just the world without labels. And in this case, we've got some national parks as a feature service. And then on top, we then have the text and the labels. Now, this can actually make quite a big difference. So, for example, if I was in this zoom extent and I didn't have the labels on top of the feature layers, then Southampton would then just be reading as Hampton. And especially if we're in the nitty-gritty and zoomed in, these labels can be quite important if you want them above your data layer. Now, I'm just going to show you what that looks like inside the code. So what we have is the base. So this is pretty much an empty base layer. Then we have a feature layer, which is some national parks that I found in ArcGIS Online. And at the very bottom, having the labels. So all we need to do is make sure that we add the layers to the map in the correct order. Okay. So I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. We've covered quite a bit. We've covered the difference between raster and vector. Also, how vector base maps are created in the first place using ArcGIS Pro. So we skimmed over that. We've seen some really, really cool samples of styles of vector base maps, how to customize the vector styles, and also how to implement and use them in your applications. So yeah, over to Amy and you guys if we have any questions.
Thank you, Sean. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. We've received quite a few, and we will try to get through as many as possible, but whatever we don't get to today, we will definitely address in a GeoNet blog post after this webinar. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel as we're going through some of the questions. Our first question is there a way to automatically refresh or update vector tiles if the base data changes, or would one need to recreate the vector tile set each time the base data changes?
Okay, so I'm not 100% sure on this one, so we might have to find this out for you afterwards on whether you can detect updating data and then automatically have it pull through. So as I say, I'll find that out, but something you could definitely do is schedule your updates. And a really good feature of vector tiles is that they're substantially quicker to recache than raster tiles. So that's actually quite a painless process to do.
All right, great. Thanks, Richard. What software versions are required for creating a vector tile package with ArcGIS Pro published with ArcGIS Server for use in Portal?
So this was supported as of version 10.5 of ArcGIS Enterprise. You can just use that tool that Sean showed you earlier in ArcGIS Pro.
How long does it take to create a vector tile set?
So I don't have any exact benchmarks to hand, but as I said a few minutes ago, it's really much quicker than doing traditional raster base maps. And here at Esri UK, we actually moved from using really powerful server machines to do our caches onto just regular desktop machines because it was much cheaper to do and the time saving was so much that it's still done within a reasonable time.
All right, perfect. Is it possible to create vector tile sets using a different native projection or coordinate system like UTM, for example?
Yeah, so you'll notice we gave an example earlier in the webinar of British National Grid. So when vector maps first came out, you could only do them in WGS84, but subsequently you can do different projection systems now.
Wonderful, thank you. Is it possible to somehow integrate the vector tile style editor into a custom web app builder widget? If so, how can we configure which layers are listening for color changes?
So I don't think it would be possible straight out the box, but having said that, both the vector tile style editor and MapStyler are both open source on GitHub. So you could certainly pick that up and make some changes that would do that for you.
All right, wonderful. If the vector tile set I create is using Web Mercator, can I overlay feature service layers that are natively in a different projected coordinate system?
Yep, so if you're just overlaying your feature data over one of our out-of-the-box vector basemaps, it will just reproject on the fly. But yeah, obviously it's not going to be a perfect reprojection, but generally speaking, it should be fine.
All right, starting with a feature service layer hosted in ArcGIS Online Organization account, is it possible to build a vector tile set from it using a GP tool created in Pro?
Yep, so you would be able to bring your data into ArcGIS Pro from ArcGIS Online. I'm not sure if you could use it straight like that or whether you'd have to make a copy, a local copy in ArcGIS Pro, but either way it would have the same effect. And then you could just use the create vector tile package GP tool in Pro to push that out as a vector basemap.
How does one create custom patterns for polygon fills?
So Sean, I think this might be one for you.
So I think you do have the ability to do that in ArcGIS Pro, but I wouldn't be 100% on that.
Okay. In the example where you show having vector tile on top of feature layer, which version of ArcGIS JavaScript API do you use?
So in that sample, I was using version 4, so specifically version 4.8 for that one.
You mentioned taking the vector tiles offline. Can you expand a bit on how to do that?
Yeah, so it really depends on your exact use case and what you're doing. But for example, if you were using our runtime SDKs, you can sideload the basemaps onto your device, and then the app will just reference them locally, and they'll be super fast and available offline.
Okay, great. In ArcGIS Pro, what are best practices for setting min-max scales in layers and the vector tile package?
I'd probably, what would be best is if I get back to you on that one, because it's not kind of mine or Sean's area, but I'd love to give you a more specific answer to that one. So let me get back to you on that one.
Sounds great. Can you identify against a vector tile layer and one that is cached to your device?
I think, so if you mean clicking on the base map and getting some information back from it, which I think is what you mean, the tiles don't actually have any attribution embedded into them. At the moment, that will come in a future update. So at the moment, you wouldn't be able to get any information from an identify off of it.
Can I share these base maps to users of ArcGIS for Office or ArcGIS for Adobe?
That's a really good question. I would have to check that one, I'm afraid.
Can we give different styles on different zoom scales and switch between them?
Yeah, Sean, did you want to take that one?
Yes, so you do have the ability to change styles based on the extent and zoom level. So I may have showed a little bit earlier the water when we zoomed in and out. So that is possible to change.
Can you print vector tiles, or will we ever be able to?
I can maybe answer this one, Richard. So actually, one of the samples I showcased earlier was a printing sample with the JavaScript API. So version 4.8, and it's an example of the printing widget. But I'm not too sure if you're regarding JavaScript or ArcGIS Pro with that question.
How do you overwrite an existing vector tile layer from Pro/Share tab?
I'm pretty sure there's just an option in the GP tool to either create a new layer or overwrite an existing one. If you overwrite it, it will just go to the exact same endpoint. So your users will just see the updated one.
Can we create vector tiles for a part of larger area and then replace it into the larger area main vector tile?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, to be honest. Do you mean kind of augmenting one of our global services with your specific area of data, maybe? In which case, yeah, I'm not 100% sure.
How do you deploy from the tool you showed to an on-premise portal? What version does that portal need to be?
So it'll need to be, so for the styling tools, well, I guess it would be the same either for publishing or for styling. It would be 10.5 or above ArcGIS Enterprise.
Okay, going back to the previous question, they built a large vector tile set and they want to update a part of it, just to clarify. Does that help?
Yeah, so in which case you could dive in and update it in Pro. That will kind of go back to the same question that I'm going to clarify about whether you could update a small section based on the underlying data changing, or whether you'd have to recache the whole thing. So I can clarify that later, but as I say, if it is the latter and you do have to recache it, it's really quick, so it's not too onerous a task.
Great, thank you for clarifying. What are the best practices for symbolizing complex polylines for vector tile packages?
Not too sure on that one. Sean, do you have an answer on that one?
So that's probably best checking out some of our cartography tips and tricks for that. I'm pretty sure there'll be a lot of things available online and probably on GeoNet for that.
Great, thanks. Will same styles apply for 2D and 3D maps?
Yeah, both 2D and 3D use the exact same vector tile packages, so it just carries across.
Great.
Oh, unless you meant, sorry, if you mean like editing the styles on the fly, you're always going to be looking at the 2D map as you do that, but it will carry across to a 3D scene once you've done it.
Okay, thanks. Are we able to create vector tiles using Arcmap in the near future?
Not as far as I'm aware. I haven't actually tried it personally, but I don't think the functionality is there. So it'll be ArcGIS Pro to do that.
All right. Would this be a solution for making an elevation-based map like contours, DEM, etc.?
No, so elevation maps are always going to be raster based just by virtue of the way that they work. So you could drape a vector based map on top of a DEM, for example, but the DEM is going to be a raster underneath that.
All right, perfect. Are vector tile base maps compatible with web maps used in ArcGIS Collector app?
Not at the moment. So we have a next generation collector that's scheduled for release later this year, and that will fully support vector tiles, but the current version doesn't, unfortunately.
Can you delete items, including text/labels that you don't want from your custom vector tiles?
You could do it two ways, basically. Either whilst you're publishing it, if you never want those things, but if you sometimes want them and sometimes don't, then the best thing is to adjust it in the styling. So you'll notice, as Sean was showing you on the vector tile style editor, that you can show and hide certain elements, even at certain zoom levels if you wanted to. But what that would let you do is have the same base map, and then in different applications you could apply a different style JSON and be able to remove things that you don't want in one app and show things that you do in another.
Okay, great. How do the vector basemaps described relate to caching vector feature layers in Arcmap 10.5?
I'm not too familiar with caching vector features. My guess would be that they're not tile-based and that the basemaps are, but that would be kind of an assumption. So, Sean, did you know on that one, or?
Yeah, I couldn't give a. I could give a guess, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to guess
Okay.
it and get back to
Yeah,
you on that one.
let's confirm on that one for you.
Okay. How do you incorporate multi-scale generalizations when building a vector tile package?
Sean?
So multi-scale visualizations. So is that based on the extent or where they're zoomed? If so, in the vector style editor, it will actually show which extent each layer is visible at on the left-hand side, depending on which layer you have selected.
Yeah, and in terms of the generalization, the vector map specification kind of does that for you. So you don't really need to do that explicitly.
Okay, and how do you recache it? What tool or process are you using?
So it's always ArcGIS Pro, using the same caching tool as you did to create it in the first place.
All right, perfect. With no programming skill, can I use ArcGIS Pro to bring in some of my own layers and put it into a vector base map? For example, my own street center line in a gray base map.
Yeah, I think I'm not 100% sure on whether you can bring in one of our existing vector base maps and kind of recache it into another one. I suspect not, because it's already tiled. So if you had all the data that you wanted, your street lines, but also the underlying data that you want underneath it, whatever kind of gray layers, then you certainly could. In terms of with no coding knowledge, then sure, all of the creating your base map and caching it out doesn't require any code. It's all kind of GP tools and click driven. So that side of it's straightforward.
Thank you. Is it possible to use SVG icons to style vector tile points?
Do you know that one, Sean?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
All right. Can one use vector maps to capture live events such as car accidents, crime, fires, trash on city streets, and add them to ArcGIS Online?
I suppose to an extent you could. I mean, generally I would recommend just using normal feature layers instead, because they can be updated within like sub-seconds. The problem with vector tiles is that they have to be cached, and even though it's quick to do that, it's still, depending on the size of the base map, it's going to be, you know, a few hours or so. So generally, for any kind of data that's updating very regularly, we'd always recommend feature layers. And for reference data that's not updating 1 week to the next, let's say, then you would use the vector tiles for a base map.
Wonderful. Where do you suggest someone start learning more about creating custom vector base maps with the ArcGIS API for JavaScript?
So you wouldn't be creating them in the JavaScript API. You'd always be creating them in ArcGIS Pro. And then in JavaScript or any of our other developer tools is where you kind of consume them and optionally restyle them as well, or bring in a style that you've created. If you want to do that, if you want to just bring in a base map and restyle it in JavaScript, then there's a couple of blog posts that you can find on GeoNet with tutorials how to do that.
Great. And our very last question, is it possible to use right left side offset line symbology with a vector tile base layer?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so in the vector style editor, there is an offset option. So when you have a layer selected, with some of the features, you can choose an offset. So there's a translate XY at the very bottom there. So we do have the ability to change that.
All right. Thank you, Richard and Sean, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Styling Vector Basemaps. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me using my email address in your follow-up email. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. We will be providing a recording of this presentation, which will be available within 7 to 10 business days on the go.esri.com/geodev page. On behalf of Esri and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.